I think we're ready to start. Our presenters are here. I think we're going to get going now. Yes. We have, today we have we have 3 papers instead of the original 4 because one of our presenters could not be with us. And the first presentation is virtual. I will let presenters briefly introduce themselves before the start of their papers. Their names, obviously their full biographical information is in the program. Please silence your cell phones if you have not already, and we will take questions after the last presenter has finished. Okay. So or you can sit up here. You can stay up here. Oh, no, I'm sorry. You can stay up here. Oh, that's right. Yes, of course.
Let's see, the volume is not coming on. Oh.
Virtually to this conference and to be able to share my work on my reading of Cather's Fools alongside the Russian writers. So this current contribution is part of a broader ongoing research project examining the probable impact of Russian realist writers on Willa Cather's works with a focus on folklore. Owing to the time allocated for the presentation, I have chosen to narrow my reading to a few selected texts that are Dostoevsky's, Tolstoy's, and Chekhov's, and to the analysis of, I quote, a stylized holy fool, a term coined by Ewa M. Thompson. The analysis grounds itself on Willa Cather's own words in her letters and in her interviews, and attesting to her having read these authors. To fully grasp the Russian soul, we must understand that humility of heart and simplicity of spirit are central values in the Orthodox Church. During the liturgy, it is at the crucial moment preceding the entrance to the Gospels, symbolizing Christ's presence, that the choir recites the 9 blessings of the Sermon on the Mount. Emphasis is placed on the notion of poverty of spirit, on both material and worldly poverty, and on the divine reward that comes from self-denial. Edward Garnett, husband of translator Constance Garnett, captures this poverty of spirit in his introduction to Ivan Turgenev's English collection entitled A Desperate Character and Other Stories. He puts the aspiration of the Russian soul in the right terms. The Orthodox religion, he says, implies genuine self-denial, a condescension of the ego, and an inclination toward divine providence, conferring on the Russian his greatness of soul and his facility to love his neighbor. The Russian soul willingly seeks to sacrifice its own will, accepting scorn and suffering at the expense of conquest, individuality, and worldly human greatness. From Alexander Pushkin to Anton Chekhov and Fyodor Dostoevsky, Russian realist writers of the 19th and early 20th centuries frequently addressed the theme of poverty of spirit in their works. For example, right at the opening of Chekhov's short story entitled The Bishop, the narrator briefly mentions a fool for Christ, a Eurodivy in Russian, thus revealing the cultural phenomenon and identity of madness in the Orthodox faith, while at the same time highlighting the bishop's Christian humility and simplicity. Holy foolishness, in Greek xalis, was a common spiritual way of life in Byzantine society. It spread to Russia long after the country was Christianized by the Tsar Vladimir in 988, becoming an identifying symbol of pre-revolutionary Russian society. George Fedotov points out that due to the development of mystical contemplation at the end of the Kievan period, divine madness manifested in the Muscovite period, making medieval Russia the golden age of sanctity. The appearance of the fool for Christ has varied over the centuries. Before the 19th century, nudity was one of the visual characteristics of the Eurodivi. Nudity was the corollary effect of great spirituality. This practice was abandoned in the 19th century, except in remote corners in Eurodivi wore rags instead. Willa Cather's body of work is a potpourri of diverse representations of madness. In her novel One of Ours, published in 1922, for example, she adopts the orthodox position of a humble and humiliated heart. The protagonist, Claude, who embodies both the Russian superfluous man, according to David Stout, and resembles Dostoevsky's Alyosha Karamazov, one of the protagonists in The Brothers Karamazov, in his sensitivity, as we shall see later, confesses to readers his broken and humiliated spirit. This strange facet of the simpleton, the voluntary humiliation of self, is central to Cather's main character. However, although Claude Wheeler does not entirely embody the figure of the Eurodivi, Maëlie, the maid, and Mrs. Wheeler's simplicity are no less indicative of the orthodox perspective evoked in Claude's intimate confession. Maëlie, Claude tells us, is one of those gentle spirits who possesses a divine wisdom beneath their simplicity. Cather seems to have captured the Russian soul in her work, for it is the same humility, this childlike spirit found in the painting by the Russian painter Nesterov that Claude Wheeler describes. Immersed in the Orthodox faith, the Russian writers brought to light the Russian values of madness and weakness, values that were drawn from the ideal of the humiliated Christ by the early Russian saints. Although the properties of madness were entirely rooted in the Orthodox tradition in 19th century Russia, the archetype of the madman in secular Russian literature took different forms. Some madmen personified humility and reclusion from the world, others wisdom and clairvoyance, or adopted the appearance and gestures of the jester. Given the growing number of impostures and charlatanism, fake fools were described in the Russian literature of the period. Two examples are the characters of the monk Ferapont in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, and the false Eurodivi, Vasily, in Turgenev's short story entitled A Strange Story, towards whom the narrator feels repugnance. Yet, despite a certain mistrust of madness, the phenomenon of madness remains central to Russian culture, embodying both the characteristics of the folk hero, Ivan the Durak, and the spiritual and moral ideal of Christianity. Essentially, by writing about madness or simplicity of spirit, Russian writers have captured human nature and the spiritual state of the soul. The paradigm of the Eurodivi offered Russian writers the model on which to base their writing for the perfect human being. Thus, in the works of Russian realist writers, we find secular characters who fit into the paradigm of madness, combining humility and wisdom. However, as the novel, a Western genre, did not allow for the easy portrayal of a God-fearing fool, previously accepted in Russian popular literature, writers had to portray sophisticated, socially acceptable madmen who fully appropriated Western codes while retaining the medieval spirit of divine madness. While some fools retain the Muscovite traits of foolishness, like Lizaveta Smirdyachaya in The Brothers Karamazov or Grisha in Tolstoy's Childhood, the main characters embrace an attitude of divine madness without the paradigmatic appearance of the Eurodivi. More sophisticated characters, such as Alyosha Karamazov or Prince Mishkin in The Idiot, Pierre Bezukhov in Tolstoy's War and Peace, Konstantin Levin in Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, or simpler rural protagonists like Turgenev's Lukeria, Chekhov's Lipa, to name but a few, made their appearance in the literature of Imperial Russia. These new fools adapt their behavior to their society and are, for Ewa M. Thompson, stylized holy fools. They play a central role in the narrative and no longer have a marginal role. Their behavior exposes the shortcomings of a modern, industrialized society and highlights the importance of a return to tradition, origins, and the land. We note that these stylized saints interact with real role-deviers. For example, Alexei Karamazov interacts with his starets Zozima. Pierre Bezukhov interacts with Platon Karatev. According to Thompson, another characteristic of these sophisticated fools is their ability to interact easily with characters of lower social status. So similarly, we find the American equivalent in O Pioneers and in One of Ours. Every sophisticated fool is replicated in a foolish character. Alexandra is surrounded and supported by Carl and Crazy Ivar. The souls of Claude Wheeler and Mayeli are linked by the esteem they hold each other. The identity of Cather's men is entirely in keeping with the paradigm of the secular Russian fool. While for David Stauck, these male protagonists are prototypes of the Russian superfluous man, I would argue that these characters take on the traits of Russian stylized holy fools. The superfluity that Stauck reads into the wandering man in the characters of Carl Lindstrom, Jim Burden, or Claude Wheeler is merely a mark of the wandering Russian fool who has no attachments. Claude Wheeler's personality resembles that of Alyosha Karamazov and the brothers Karamazov and Pierre Bezukhov in War and Peace. Handsome, different from his brothers, his name is a source of humiliation. Misunderstood by his father and peers, except by his mother and the strange Mayeli. Odd, gauche, he nurtures within himself the quest for a meaningful life. Claude Wheeler, like Alyosha Karamazov, represents the youth of a bygone era and puts into practice Dostoevsky's statement about the sacrifice of the young for the sake of just values. But unlike Alyosha, who sacrifices a few years of his youth to the monastery, Claude takes sacrifice to the extreme, by going further in his martyrdom. Like a saint, he gives himself body and soul to valor, to the free land, and to his people. On the other hand, Close goes through several revelatory instances that guide him towards an understanding of life and its ultimate epiphany, self-sacrifice. His life parallels that of Pierre Bezukhov, who possesses, through revelatory stages, his unsuccessful marriage to Elena, his decision to join the army after feeling a sense of emptiness following his divorce, his meeting with Karatev, all lead him to self-realization and to the ability to understand people and to see through them. A revealing passage in Claude's clairvoyant character takes place at home when he takes a bath in the moonlight. He grasps the intimate secrets of the souls of those around him, his mother's, Mayeli's, Gladys's, and also accesses the secret of those who, like him, hide unfulfilled desires or captivating dreams. One circumstance supports our interpretation of Claude as a stylized Eurodivi. Willa Cather confesses in her letter to Mr. Ulrich Johns, written on November 17, 1922, that she deliberately concealed a spiritual quest in the novel, wanting to instill in it the theme of the opera Parsifal. James Wordress recalls that Cather wanted to model a protagonist close to the eponymous character of Wagner's opera, and had long considered entitling the chapter "Biting the Eagles of the West Lie On, the Blameless Fool" by Pity Enlightened. Claude's mother, too, is another instance of the stylized holy fool. She physically embodies the sanctity of the Eurodivi. Her flesh crystallizes like the holy images in old churches, and she draws close to Claude's soul, grasping and sharing within her all his emotions. Given the dates of publication of the novels, we can see here that it is quite possible that Cather has taken over the figure of their stylized Russian fool. Jim Burden's character also dramatizes the concept of the holy fool. He also nurtures in his soul an ardent love, not for his fellow men like Alyosha, but for the landscape of the American West. He sacrifices his work and effort to it. Like the new Russian fool, Jim retains his physical innocence and youthful enthusiasm. David Stout points out that Jim is an uprooted wanderer, like the Russian superfluous man. I quote, Jim is restlessly crossing the country. His marriage is an empty formality. He has no children to give his work and future a special purpose. End of quote. However, uprootedness and vagrancy are also a sign of a form of madness. Let's remember Pierre Besouho's bastardry, his provenance from abroad, like Prince Mishkin's, whose origins are unclear. Jim also comes from afar and is an orphan. Like his two Russian counterparts, aristocrats, Jim also is described in the introduction as a successful lawyer, the democratic American equivalent of the Russian aristocracy. Moreover, like Prince Mishkin in The Idiot, who has never really loved neither Aglaya nor Anastasia Filipovna, Jim cannot love one of the hired girls because he holds the idea of woman sacred. He does not propose to these young women, potential future wives, and even fantasizes about Liena, emasculating him with the scythe. And here too, translations of The Idiot were published before Cather's. We can thus conclude that there is a possibility of an intertextual echo of foolishness. Stack also sees superfluous men in the character of Karl, particularly in his description of men in the city. However, if we study Karl's confession, we discern a man aware of the superfluous life of modern men. In contrast to the superfluous man who does not perceive the uselessness of his life, Karl puts into words the vices of an inert life. Through his choice of life and his return to Alexandria, Karl exposes inertia and advocates a return to his roots and to the land. His clear-sightedness can also be seen in his portrait of Mary Towiecki on page 304 and 305, where Karl's clairvoyance is built on a dialectic of perception, on the opposition between the visual faculty and the intuitive faculty of feeling. It is this opposition that allows us to paint an accurate portrait of Mary Towiecki. The perception of this truth is not only possible through the physical eye, but also through a deeper understanding that emanates from the soul, consciousness, and inner feeling. This highlights the spiritual and divine dimension of the Catherian protagonist. Although he does not possess all the characteristics of the fool and is not considered strange, Karl has the appearance of a Eurodivi in his physical fragility. He is a fragile boy with a pale complexion and dark, dreamy eyes, just like Prince Mishkin, whose frail health denotes a strange, divine dimension. And The Idiot on page 2. At a young age, Carl already seems to understand the suffering of the world. I quote, "The lips had already a little curl of bitterness and skepticism." Page 10. What's more, his uprooting and move to the city underline the character's liminal nature. Like the Eurodivi, wandering here and there, Carl makes no place his own. Due to the contemporaneity of the publications of Cather's works with those of the Russian writers, these stylized holy fools mentioned above consolidate the place of hypertext of the American author, suggesting that she may have transposed an Eastern European paradigm into the American West. Strangeness coupled with humility, gaucherie with clairvoyance, rootlessness with sacrifice, inertia with epiphany, bring depth to the American work and weave a spiritual backdrop worthy of a Russian masterpiece. To conclude, Cather's works abound with Eurodivi-like characters, but there's a last one, I think, that should be worthy of attention here. Blind Darno in My Antonia points to the sins of a nation that in its primary history has ill-treated, abused, and marginalized parts of its population. Close to the Fool for Christ, in his suffering, this Black American fool evokes the possible attainment of spiritual wisdom, of a humility induced by the violence done to him. But he also embodies the reconciliation of the races, an expiatory body. Blind Darno, the divine American idiot, unites the white man and the black man in a dance hall, in a place of conviviality, and metaphorically on the keys of the piano. Thank you.
That was a joke. That's it.
Okay where it is? Is that okay where it is? I'm Steve Shively, and enough said. Sometimes when we Cather fans look at what Cather read, we focus on what is usually considered classical literature. Homer and Virgil, Shakespeare, George Eliot, Tolstoy, Hawthorne. Today I want to examine her reading of a novel more often labeled popular fiction, Trilby by George du Maurier, first serialized in Harper's Monthly and then published as a book in 1894. Probably less known for the title character than for its manipulative villain Svengali, Trilby was a sensational bestseller in England and the United States. Elaine Showalter labels it the first modern bestseller in American publishing, and the first to use modern advertising and marketing techniques. Trilby quickly became a hit play, and later several popular film versions appeared, including a 1984 TV movie titled Svengali, which starred Peter O'Toole and Jodie Foster. Cather read the novel and reacted very positively. Between September 16, 1894, a week after it came out, and June 2, 1895, she wrote 4 newspaper columns praising the book for the Nebraska State Journal. And in November 1896, she wrote a tribute to du Maurier in the Home Monthly on the occasion of his death. Due to time limits and the conference theme of reading, I won't get into an analysis of the intersections between Trilby and Cather's literary writing. but it is an overwhelmingly rich array of potential topics. Anyone who needs a topic, start listening up. I will focus on Cather's reading of the novel in the 1890s, before she began her own career as a literary artist. But of course, that's the writing that informs so much of her later work. George du Maurier was born in Paris in 1834 and spent much of his childhood there. He was a mediocre student, preferring daydreaming to Latin and romantic novels to the classics. After wandering through the study of chemistry and music in England, and after his father's death, the remaining family returned back to Paris, where George studied painting. Despite living with his mother and younger siblings, du Maurier lived a rather bohemian life in the Latin Quarter, which he would recreate in Trilby and make his fellow art students characters in the book. Not yet 25, after only 2 years of fine art study, a detached retina diminished du Maurier's sight for the rest of his life. He had adjusted his dream of being a painter, moved to London, and had a career of 30 years as an illustrator of books and magazines, most notably drawing cartoons for the satirical magazine Punch. He married and lived in comfort among artist and writer companions, including Henry James, George Eliot, James Whistler, and more. In 1880, he illustrated the first edition of James's Washington Square. When his failing eyesight made this career impossible to continue, he turned to writing, publishing his moderately successful first novel at the age of 56. Trilby was his second novel, and it was wildly successful both in England and the United States. Du Maurier also did 120 illustrations for the book. Trilby's popularity was helped when James Whistler made very public claims of libel against Harper's and du Maurier for du Maurier's obvious and biting satirical portrayal of Whistler as Joe Sibley, a Latin Quarter aesthete du Maurier decked out as a peacock. George du Maurier died of heart failure in 1896, a year before his last novel was published posthumously. Today, he might be better known for his grandchildren, most born after his death. His daughter Sylvia married Arthur Llewellyn Davies and had 5 sons, who, for family friend J.M. Barrie, became the inspiration for Peter Pan. George du Maurier's son Gerald was the father of Daphne du Maurier, famed author of the Gothic thrillers Rebecca and the Birds. Now for an embarrassingly brief summary of the novel. It begins with an epigraph from a French folk song that announces the oppositions that run throughout the book. The English translation is, "Alas, I know a song of love, sad and gay by turns." The novel opens in the art studio shared by 3 promising painters in Paris's Latin Quarter. Colloquially, they are known as Little Billy, the Laird, and Taffy. They are befriended by musicians Svengali and Gecko, and one day, a grisette, a beautiful working girl, wanders in to listen to their music. She does housekeeping and poses for artists in the All Together. And that phrase originated in this novel. She tries to sing, but is completely tone deaf and unaware of that, although her voice is clear and powerful. As the plot unfolds, Svengali lives up to his notoriety. He tries to persuade Trilby to let him train her voice, but she finds him repulsive and frightening. Instead, Trilby and Little Billy fall in love. A lot better than being a musician. But his family objects due to their perceptions of a Paris working girl. And you might notice her cap here, because the Trilby hat will become very popular, but it doesn't appear in the novel at all. This is what I would call a tam o' shanter, and the Trilby hat appeared in one of the play versions. So Trilby leaves Paris when his parents won't let them marry, and soon falls under the spell of Svengali, who hypnotizes her. Under his spell, she becomes a talented singer, the diva, La Svengali. She always performs in a hypnotic trance. She doesn't know, and none of the audience know. 5 years later, in the height of her success, the three young artists, little Billy is now famous and successful, come upon her performing in a concert. And just before another performance, Gecko is tired of being subordinate to Svengali and upset with his treatment of Trilby, so he stabs Svengali, who is then stricken by a heart attack. Because he cannot induce the trance upon Trilby, she is unable to sing in tune, yet completely unaware of the source of her talent. The audience laughs and humiliates her. She remembers nothing of her singing career other than traveling. Svengali dies, and Trilby follows a few weeks later. Little Billy is devastated, and soon he dies as well. Several years later, Taffy and his wife, little Billy's sister, take a second honeymoon in Paris and encounter Gecko the violinist, who tells them the whole story of Svengali's evil treatment of Trilby. Taffy and his wife happily leave Paris behind with its tragedies and gaiety and return to their respectable middle-class country home in England. So what did Cather think of this melodrama? She liked it a lot. Her first column came out only 1 week after the book appeared. Cather wrote, "She has come to us at last in book form. Trilby, the much talked of, Trilby, the well-beloved. There has not been a heroine made for years that people have taken into their hearts and lives and loved as they have Trilby." The entire column is about the girl, the character, not the plot, the writing, or the author, who is not even named. Oh yes, Cather writes, there are plenty of admirable heroines, perfect Minervas and Hermiones, but some way, poor little Trilby seemed to need love so, and everybody gave it to her. Cather specifically mentions Trilby's altogether posing, her pretty foot, her army coat, you can see that in the slide, and her taint of Bohemia. All of these, of course, are found in Cather's life and writing. Eden Bower's nude exercising, Marion Forrester's foot thrusting out from her petticoats, Cather's own youthful military coat, and the Bohemian life of Greenwich Village lived by some of her characters and herself. A month later, Cather continued her praise, this time with more attention to Du Maurier. It is a strangely significant fact that the book, which is unquestionably the great book of the year, should be the work of a man who never wrote a novel until he was 50. She seems prescient as she intuits that what she would come to understand about her own career and her recognition that Alexander's Bridge was not her life, but O Pioneers was. She writes about Du Maurier, the notion seems to have gone abroad that a man can write before he has lived. There is only one way to see the world truly, and that is to see it in a human way. An author must live deeply and richly and generously, live not only his own life, but all lives. Cather knew this truth when she was only 21, before she could put it into practice, but it would guide her career. 2 months later, she returned to Trilby. She began by commenting on Du Maurier's illustrations for the book. The originals of the illustrations that Du Maurier it is now exhibited in New York. And the dear critics are deciding that Du Maurier cannot draw, as they have decided that he cannot write, and knows nothing whatever of music. What a storm of rage and disapproval that book has raised among the litterateurs of this country. Cather's awareness that visual presentation matters returned later in her intense concern for illustrations in her own books, as well as book design, production, and advertising. She rebuts Du Maurier's critics when she writes, "The book's greatest fault is that it has met with unqualified success that the classicists and romanticists and realists and even the moralists would give their 2 eyes for. It has done what art and correct style frequently cannot do. It has appealed to the human in humanity. It has won for itself a place in the hearts of the people. Most of us," she writes, "would write books if we could do that." Indeed. Cather also jumped on the controversy the book caused for what many called its shocking immorality. The heroine posing in the nude, the wild life of Paris's Latin Quarter, Trilby's lack of sexual purity. Cather makes one of the exaggerated claims that sometimes characterize her journalism. "There has been no book published for years which is more free from the fleshly and sensual than Trilby." She notes Du Maurier's father-like tenderness toward his creation, and also points out that Trilby wasn't written for children or to be published in St. Nicholas. Indeed, in preparing this talk, I checked out a book from the University of Nebraska Library titled Filth, Dirt, Disgust, and Modern Life, published in 1995, but it contains an essay titled Dirty Pleasure, Trilby's Filth. I'm worried that the computer remembers I checked this book out. And I should say that it explores the multiple meanings of the word filth rather than condemning the novel. Cather's final journalistic praise comes in 1896 following Du Maurier's death at the age of 62. She wrote that he had won the largest and sweetest kind of fame, the admiration of trained critics and the love of the great unliterary public that does not analyze but feels. In the summer of 1895, a year after the novel came out, Cather wrote about the fad of Trilby mania, sometimes labeled Trilbiana. Women wore Trilby shoes and clothing. A town in Florida was renamed Trilby. Children invented Trilby games. Trilby poses were struck at parties. Ice cream bars shaped like Trilby's feet became popular, and more. You see here Trilby shoe polish and the Trilby hat. One version. Cather noted that the mania had spread to Nebraska. "Well," she wrote, "it seems that the Trilby fad is limited neither by time nor space nor creed. The Episcopal Church of Beatrice is getting up a series of Trilby tableaux, which promise to be graceful and successful. This is certainly an innocent and commendable diversion and a great improvement upon the usual church lawn socials and other pale and colorless festivities at which all loyal Christians are expected to devour frozen cornstarch for the glory of God." She notes, however, that some of the good people are objecting and are refusing to allow their daughters to appear in the tableau. But she adds her opinion that the Episcopalians deserve credit for their thoroughly fin de siècle thing. The event was well covered in Beatrice newspapers, along with many ads for Trilby products. I always thought it was performed in the church lawn, but it was performed in the town's largest auditorium, the Grand Paddock Opera House. This is one of the ads in Beatrice, in the Beatrice paper. And I don't know if you can read it, but the second line, Trilby Oxfords. And the first line is also interesting. We've received a knobby line of Ladies Oxford's, the correct style. And at the end, they are dandies. Advertising was a little easier in those days. But the event was extremely successful. The Beatrice Daily Express reported the next day, the tableau dramatization of Trilby as given by local talent under the auspices of the Altar Guild of Christchurch Episcopal last evening at the Paddock was an enjoyable, brilliant, artistic, and financial success. The attendance was exceptionally large, and the performance throughout meets with the highest commendation. You won't be able to read this, I don't think, but about the fourth line down, this is a list of what they call Beatrice brevities. About the fourth line down, and this appeared the day before the show, it says, the quartet from the First National Bank is not appearing in the Trilby program. Why not? And that's the extent of it. Trilby echoes in some ways, or is echoed in some ways, responses to the Harry Potter books. Bestsellers, complaints about morality, massive marketing of Potter-inspired products, costumes, posing, and more. I've focused here on Cather's responses to Trilby. The topic, however, is ripe for analytical studies of Trilby's echoes in Cather's later life and writing. The trajectory of a female artist, especially a singer. The importance of advertising and promotion, the role of men in a female artist's development, women repeatedly being the object of male gazing, anti-Semitism, and it's bad, gender ambiguity and androgyny. On the first appearance of Trilby, du Maurier writes, and this is in the book, one felt instinctively that it was a real pity she wasn't a boy. She would have made such a jolly one. These few days of the spring conference is good to join colleagues who are excited about Cather's books and hope they are popular. But it's also good to look at a book of popular fiction that excited Cather. How do I get out of this?
Hi, I'm Shellie Sclan, and the only visual I have is my T-shirt, which is one of the painting on which the Song of the Lark title is based. So, and it's gone through too many washings, so you probably can't see it. So I am going to consider how Willa Cather's reading of two novels by the woman she called one of the great Georges. Is that good? Yeah, you have to tell me what to do here. Sure. Yeah. Okay. Because I'm having a seeing problem and a hearing. It's one of the bad things about getting old. One of the many. Okay. So the two novels, The Mill on the Floss, which is the one that she wrote about at great length, was Eliot's second novel, and Daniel Deronda was Eliot's final novel. And the arc of my talk today is how it helped Willa Cather confront the tragedies of family feeling that are at the heart of the woman artist's struggle to leave home. And I there's one title in here, because when I started doing this, I was thinking a lot about Jane Austen and Virginia Woolf, and Virginia Woolf's thing about thinking, women think back through their mothers. And then I realized what I was really writing about was what Cather termed, Thea Kronberg's Floundering Escape. And so I had changed the name, thinking it might be in tune with the humor that is all through Cather, and it is also through George Eliot. And sometimes it's hard to see because it seems so weighty, but there's a lot of humor. And my title was She's Leaving Home, Bye-Bye, Willa Cather Reading George Eliot's Floundering Escapes. In the columns about books and authors Willa Cather wrote in the mid-1890s, George Eliot was one of a handful of exceptions to Cather's mistrust of women authors. Among Cather's objections were the sentimentality and subjectivity to which women were particularly prone. Oops. And here is just the beginning of what turned out to be like a 3-page, in the World and the Parish. I know that Daniel Deronda, 1876, is considered George Eliot's best novel, and that Middlemarch, 1872, ranks next in the judgment of the critics. The critics may say what they please, but of all George Eliot's masterpieces, give me that one in which he touched the hearts of the people, The Mill on the Floss. It's one of the books that we take into our hearts. It becomes associated with all that is best in our lives and as dear to us as the places and memories of our childhood. It is the novel of family. Okay, let me go back. Okay. Now, that both Cather and Eliot might be guilty of the same infractions that they did not accuse George Eliot of, but of the sentimentality and subjectivity, it did not seem to occur to Cather at the time that, at the time, sorry, I'm going to different numbers here. Okay, I already did that, 2, 3, okay. And that's one of the marvelous things about anyone's readerly imagination. We can't seem to see things when we are so up close and personal to them. But for, I think, all the people in this room who are big readers, whether for work or play, or both at different times in our lives, we are never reading the same book twice, as I found repeatedly while preparing this essay. And once she herself began writing and publishing fiction, Cather never again wrote so directly, or really directly at all, about George Eliot. But I would contend that she did continue to write about the importance of childhood influences. So for example, for the rising opera star Thea Kronberg in The Song of the Lark, these memories of the people and places in her provincial hometown are inspirational and grounding. They save me, the old things, is how she defends her choices to her former sweetheart, Fred Ottenberg, the wealthy and married beer prince. And by the way, rereading parts of Mill on the Floss last night, I ran into that word sweetheart, which I have never actually heard anyone use in common parlance, but it must have been this word that kept occurring in various fictions because George Eliot makes fun of it too. In Lucy Gayheart, written when Cather was approaching 60, these emotional ties have an intractable pull with the same sort of fatal consequences that Cather saw and never mentioned in the gushing appreciation of The Mill and the Floss she wrote in her early 20s. George Eliot and Willa Cather had many qualities in common. They were both personally ambitious, and they wrote about ambitious women, often at odds with families and communities they both loved and fled. Both were intellectuals who could feel blinded and blindsided by their own emotional intensity and receptivity. They both portrayed this emotionality as fatal weaknesses in their heroines, often because of the way strong feelings could further complicate the questions of ambition, love, and success for women in general and women artists in particular. And since both of them wrote about women performers, it may also be part of the whole live performance thing and the live performance of music. Neither wrote fiction about female authors. The Mill and the Floss was Eliot's second novel and her most autobiographical. It is also her one tragic novel. And like many tragedies from Oedipus and Antigone to Hamlet, it is not just a novel of the family, but the tragedy of the talented and brilliant young person who was unable to make their escape. Successful as both were, both Eliot and Cather, it might have been Eliot and Cather's story as well, and their nightmares, had they succumbed to that undertow. What got them out was their ambition. What kept them going was not just their public recognition and their love of writing and success, but the love and support in the homes and families they created once they left that family of origin and that childhood home. In 1932, while the seeds for Lucy Gayheart were already percolating, which was her second portrait of the musical artist as a young woman, Willa Cather was asked by her publisher to write a preface for the Jonathan Cape edition of her first such portrait of the artist, this 1915 novel, The Song of the Lark. And she was very reluctant to write this, and she said, well, all right, I'm going to write it. The tone of the preface is quasi-defensive, quasi-apologetic, treating her novel more like a journalistic account rather than a work of fiction that she and the author created. She writes that the tale about Thea Kronberg's personal life becomes paler as the imaginative life becomes richer, but it does not excuse my story from becoming paler. And now this is a quote. The story set out to tell of an artist's awakening and struggle, her floundering escape from a smug, domestic, self-satisfied, provincial world of utter ignorance. What I cared about was, and still care about, was the girl's escape. And I'm going to pause here because I cut that out. Is anyone who's read Song of the Lark, if you see that description, smug, domestic, self-satisfied, provincial world of utter ignorance, it doesn't even come close to, summing up what Thea and Cather writing it found in that town. Blah, blah, blah. Now, so what I cared about is the girl's escape, the play of blind chance, the way in which commonplace occurrences fell together to liberate her from commonness. She seemed wholly at the mercy of accident. But to persons of her vitality and honesty, fortunate accidents always happened. And this always made me kind of pause every time I read it, because, it really basically said, if you weren't a star, if you weren't this triumphant person, you didn't deserve to have fortunate accidents. So I wanted to explore the reality of these accidents, of course, were constructed by Willa Cather. And so I'm now going to go into what I think were the contributions that her reading, not of Mill and the Floss, but that first novel she mentioned in her list of, how the critics love them, Daniel Deronda, which was Eliot's final novel. And by the way, it was one that raised enormous critical controversy, because it had two plots. It had what was known as the Jewish plot, and then it had the plot of Gwendolyn Harleth, who gambles, and it's all very dramatic. So it just wasn't. And by the time Cather was even writing this at the end of the 1890s, Eliot was basically going out of fashion. But here we go. In The Song of the Lark, the isolated Taya Kronberg realizes when she's in her second year of Chicago and she's sick and she's feeling terrible, that she wants the musically knowledgeable and generous beer prince Fred Ottenberg as a sweetheart. He is charming, insightful, and willing to do anything for Taya, including sending her to Panther Canyon, where Cather gives her the transformative and emboldening experience Cather herself had in the summer of 1912 that led her to quit her editorial job at McClure's and, pushing 40, dedicate herself to writing fiction. Cather situates Taya's particular experience of music in a religious tradition when she is in Panther Canyon and in that whole ancient peoples chapter. And it's a religious tradition, and a classical religious tradition, reminiscent of Friedrich Nietzsche's homage to Wagner in The Birth of Tragedy out of the spirit of music. And in so doing, elevates what can feel like an egomaniacal self-aggrandizement into the anonymous, ancient, and noble human endeavor of making art. And if you'll remember, the end of Song of the Lark ends by saying that someone like Taya, it gives those young people stuck in those towns hope and dreams, which is also a little arrogant, let's say. Okay, so what I suggest is that Cather is aiming to reverse the terrifying fate of Al-Khwarizmi, a once famous opera singer in George Eliot's final novel, Daniel Deronda, and it occurs 3/4 of the way out of at the end of the novel. It's only 2 chapters, but it's quite astounding. And she tells her son, who she has now met, her son who she gave away, that on the death of her father and the death of her husband, she renounced any connection with her Jewish heritage and gave her son to a British lord, so he would be raised as a British gentleman. And here are the details of what Al-Khwarizmi, what happened to her. For 9 years, she is the greatest lyric actress in Europe, like a queen. But now she is dying and wants to give her son the inheritance that her father wanted to give him. And she felt like she was like a vehicle. And this is what she says: I meant to be free and to live for my art. And then something befell me, like a fit of forgetfulness. And I'm thinking, the thing that happened with Svengali with Trilby when Svengali died, but of course that was written way after this, and probably they read, George du Maurier, I'm sure, read Daniel Deronda. George, what's his name? Henry James wrote like a satiric play about it, in which the voices of different critical opinions get a voice. But then something befell me, like a fit of forgetfulness. I began to sing out of tune. Another woman was thrusting herself in my place. I could not endure the prospect of failure and decline. It drove me to marry. I made believe I preferred being the wife of a Russian noble. I made believe. I acted that part. It was because I felt my greatness sinking away from me, as I feel my life sinking now. I would not wait until men said she had better go. Now, one of the things that I've always felt that was lurking in Cather's novels was her fear that she wouldn't be able to keep doing it. That, there's that line in Macbeth, oh, not to be thus, but to be safely thus. And I think that Al-Khwarizmi's story is something that really permeated not just Cather's unconscious, but also probably a lot of women writers. And in fact, George Eliot wrote a verse drama about 6 or 7 years before she wrote Daniel Deronda. And in it, an opera singer is given a choice to marry this aristocrat who, like Fred Ottenberg, has everything. And in fact, unlike Fred Ottenberg, though, gives her a choice. She would have to give up her career and marry him. And Fred, of course, will do anything he can to support Taya's career, which I always felt like was kind of almost too good to be true. And she chooses, indeed, that she's going to continue with her career. And then she loses her voice. And of course, he's gone by now. And the ending is kind of, she becomes kind of a philanthropist. Wait, I think I lost what happened with Fred here. So what I felt was, forgive me for this. Yes, okay. So what is the plot of Song of the Lark? She has this sweetheart, Fred. He follows her to Panther Canyon. They have these, really physical, challenging scenes. The book cover that Penguin Books put on the cover of Song of the Lark in 2005, and not many people have seen it, is a Swedish painting from 1888 of a naked young woman who even has pubic hair, which was very scandalous at the time and even now, and she's standing in a pond. And although the first reaction of many people who saw it was, oh my God, really? This is on the cover of Song of the Lark? But when you read it, it's very suggestive that is what she was doing while she was down there in Panther Canyon. And so when they leave Panther Canyon, she doesn't know what she's doing. She doesn't want to go back to Chicago. And Fred says, why don't you come with me to Mexico? And we could get married there. We can't get married in Chicago because I have this family that would make us do all these various things. And she says, yes, she'll go. And he's kind of shocked that she says yes so easily. And she says something like the following, that first it was hard for her to leave Moonstone, and then it was hard for her to leave Harsanyi, but she had to do it, and in a way she got used to doing it, so she's going to go off with Fred. And that's the end of the Ancient People chapter, book, part. So the next time we see her, it's 4 months later, and she is in New York, and she has telegraphed to Dr. Archie to come and meet her in New York, and she will borrow money from him in order to go to Germany. Now, this is one of those accidents that is kind of hard to really compass, that all these things fall together. And I will submit to you that because Fred announces that he, of course, is married. I think I skipped that part, yeah. Fred announces he's married, and he's married to the same kind of woman that Dr. Archie is, who's this horrible woman, and now she's in a mental hospital. He can't get a divorce. And so then what happens is Taya, at this point, unlike the other bohemian, artists that Fred hung out with, and he thought that she wouldn't react so strongly, she is a Moonstone girl, and she's going to reconnect with that place that she thought was so provincial. She wants to reconnect with it now. And in calling Dr. Archie, she manages to do that. Because, of course, later on in the novel, she says that it's Moonstone that keeps her going. She remembers that everything that happens to her, she measures on the $600 insurance policy that Ray Kennedy leaves her. And so this is all very good, too good to be true, but actually it was it was the center of George Eliot's life. I don't know if any of you know the personal adventures of George Eliot, but one of them is that after a very religious childhood, she left home, she lived in London, and she met George Henry Lewis, a friend of Herbert Spencer, who she also fell in love with, but Spencer told her she was too ugly to marry. And she and George Henry Lewis, who also was a theater critic and a novelist, a music critic, and he also was a scientist. And he was going off to Germany to write a biography of Goethe. And Mary Ann Evans went with him. At which point she became persona non grata until the day she died. That Queen Victoria loved reading her novels, but she would in no way meet her. So they came back. Now, the thing about George Henry Lewis was that he really believed that Mary Ann Evans was capable of being a great writer, a great novelist. And one of the first things he did is he had her, they started reading Jane Austen's novels aloud to each other. And sure enough, is my time almost up? Okay. So that's that part. And I haven't even gotten to Noel and the Floss and the ending. Do I have any time? No. Okay. What? Yeah, just a few sentences are that. If you'll remember, Tom Tolliver, Maggie's brother, who she adored, really believed in punishing her, and he was very moralistic. And again, as I was going through, the part 3, when it's all Harry's story, of course, he could have gone and been nice to her, but he thought she needed to be punished. And then I thought, well, there's my whole paper, and that's it. Thank you. Oh, wow. What?
Okay, those were 3 excellent papers, and we have time for some questions.
Steve, just to clarify in my mind, was Trilby first written in French and then became English, or the guy wrote it in English first?
So Steve, is when Cather's engaging with it, it's serialization and novel, but does she see a play production later on, like with the Trilby hat, like either when she's in Pittsburgh or New York or what have you?
I don't know enough to know a real answer to that. My sense is that he was surprised by its success, didn't have any big complaints. Even though he led a quite comfortable adulthood, always felt to face disappointments. And certainly, ordinary blind when you're 23 might lead you to that. But none of his career paths had worked out for him. So my sense is he didn't set grand expectations to follow up.
No, please. I actually, Shellie, what you were saying about the Song of the Lark and that idea of kind of fortunate destiny. This is sort of a comment too, but I really appreciated it because I have real problems with a lot of that novel, and not so much Taya, but the way Taya is portrayed. And the idea, there's a section about where Dr. Archie tells Taya that some people are just halfway people and their only job is to help great people succeed. And I don't like that part. And I know that's not the most mature way to respond to, but I do think that creates, it sort of creates a hierarchy that I'm not entirely comfortable with. And the novel, to some extent, almost reinforces that. So. Is it turned on? Is it flashing green? Okay. The green light.
Right. And that is, Lucy Gayheart has always gotten really smashed and gotten bad press. And it's only recently that people, I think, are according it the respect that I think it deserves. And I think it is consciously structured like a tragedy. And the end, just as Lucy Gayheart drowns in this really ridiculous way that she gets her foot caught in the root of a tree, so Maggie Tulliver goes to rescue her brother when there's who's no longer speaking to him, but now they're going to reunite in a boat, and then this industrial machinery comes and tips over the boat, and they die. And Eliot's last line on their grave, it says, "In their death they were not divided," which is what was said about King Saul and Jonathan. And then we have, this whole part with Harry mourning her, keeping those footsteps. And again, he's keeping those footsteps, but he sort of turns mechanically away. And then we get giving a glance mechanically at the footsteps, and the footsteps are running away, which he never got. And when he proposes to her, he doesn't even say, do you want to get married? It's sort of like, well, okay, we got 3 weeks, we can get married in about 3 weeks. And her, she is really stuck. But basically, what he cannot hear is that she wants to have a career. That in meeting Clement Sebastian, falling in love with him, she falls in love with music at the same time. And I think that when she goes back to mourn in that little town, people are so awful to her. Her sister, Harry, everyone, even Mrs. Ramsey says accomplishments. I don't like to see young musical people, young talented people take themselves too seriously. Accomplishments are the ornaments of life. They're all conspiring against her. So I feel like that, that apparently Cather changed she loved writing Song of the Lark, but then she started changing her mind. She cut a lot of it, 6,000 words. One of the lines she happened to cut, which I find incredibly shocking, is when Fred does say he has some regret that he didn't have a son, but it takes a lot of people to make one Brunhilde. She cut that line. So I think, and Lucy is an accompanist. She's not a diva. So I think that there's so much around that, and I keep changing my mind about where I feel like Cather, comes down on it, besides always saying that Lucy was silly. But also, Maggie Tulliver's cousin's name is Lucy, and Maggie is going to take the guy away from her. So, anyway, that's...
I had a question for you, Shellie. Yeah, it's green. Can you hear? Okay.
Yeah.
So, the idea of you have to escape, but then you hold on to the small town as a place to come back to, and as a place of security and inspiration. That push and pull from local to the big world and local to the big world. Cather did that her whole life until her parents were no longer living in Red Cloud. And the idea that the floundering escape is never quite entirely escape. And do you think that applies both to Lucy and to Taya?
Yes, and that again is, I apologize for the meandering thing with that. Lucy, we meet Lucy in her 3rd year in Chicago, and she doesn't seem to be very passionate. You know, she works really hard. She but it's working with Sebastian. It's falling in love with music at the same time she falls in love. And she has all of these doubts. And then when he dies, she's bereft. She doesn't want to stay in Chicago. Everything will remind her of him. And when she's back there, she says she doesn't know why she went back. For some reason, she thought she would find comfort. And I think from the very beginning, Lucy loves living in Chicago. She feels like herself when she's in Chicago. That you know, when she's back in that little room, she feels like she finds herself. She wants to get out of there. And when she goes back, then she reverts to like wanting Harry in a way that she never wanted him before. And what I think, and Harry then, after she dies and Pauline dies, he becomes like her father's adopted son playing chess. When, you know, much earlier, he said he'd have to swallow the watchmaker. And so I think that Harry, in a lot of ways, is described so much like Tom Tolliver, and this guy who has no sense. He wants her to be a hostess. He doesn't want, and that's not what music is to her. So I think she got stuck there. And again, the symbolism of her going skating, everybody in town knows that they've diverted the river. Pauline even thinks about warning her, but oh, she probably knows, and Lucy always runs away. And then when she falls through the ice, suddenly she's feeling alive and she's going to get out, and her skate gets stuck in the root of a tree. And I think the town kills her, and that's certainly the way, you know, in that old way, and how, and the jealousy, and really the complete, except for her father, who she describes looking like Cather describes him looking like a daguerreotype of a minor German poet. And he's just, it's all about pleasure and happiness, and that's not what a life as a musician is going to be about. And I think she learns how to be a musician with him, and she's very, and when, what's his name? Auerbach says something like, her teacher says, oh, you know, you should marry that, you know, the big Westerner and have a garden, and that's the happy life. And it protects you from disappointments. And she says, that's because you don't live in one of those small towns. I would rather be plucked up by those carrots that you have planted there than go back. And that seemed pretty clear to me. And when I taught it, one of the things that was really interesting to me, that the kids who were born and raised in New York City kind of didn't get it. And then when I'd say, how many of you came to New York from a suburb or a small town and you understand what Lucy is, you know, they all raise their hands. You have to, in a way, be born not in a big city to know the desperation to get out. And I think Cather really, really lays it out there.
I actually have a question for Steve. How close does the stage play hew to the novel? I'm thinking about Uncle Tom's Cabin and just the incredible popularity. I mean, Uncle Tom's Cabin is a 19th century bestseller, and the stage play, which really veers so far off in all of its iterations that it gains a life of its own.
And I don't know. I haven't seen one of the drama productions, but my sense is that they take quite a bit of artistic freedom. The majority of the plays and movies have Svengali in the title. And he's clearly the character that captures a lot of people's imagination. There's something that attracts us to evil. And so he becomes, I think, even more dominant than he is. And my sense is they're less melodramatic about romance and the evilness of Svengali. And Trilby as a victim are emphasized more.
It is amazing that you have a church presenting tableaus of, I mean, it really, that is, you see the kind of everything moves toward the middle. Every kind of the, you know, what the kind of, you know, popularization, how that, you know, even in terms of, you know, I'm saying this badly, but everything kind of moves toward, everything popular sort of moves into kind of the bourgeois sphere. You know, if it's high culture, if it's low culture, it ultimately kind of, you know, hits the middle class and becomes on some level respectable. I mean, that.
Yeah. Another issue that in turning it into drama as well as a novel, compared to Cather's novels about female artists and their development, there's very little struggle with Trilby. She doesn't go off for years to study. She doesn't have to do the sing in a church choir while you're getting, you know, training, and that she's hypnotized. So it's the notion of hard work is really removed from it. If you're charming, if you're beautiful, and then someone may wave a magic wand and you'll become an artist. And I find that really weird, but that attracted people. But that's not, I'm surprised Cather liked that as much as she seems to have.
Steve, it is green. Steve, going in a completely different direction. When you were doing research for this paper and you chose this book, Trilby, to write about, did you see and discard any other popular literature that you know Cather would have enjoyed?
Yes, but can I remember at the moment those titles?
Oh, how do you pronounce her name? And she's in Coming Aphrodite. Wida.
OIDA. Yeah. 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 There are some titles that, yes, I caught, but I'm not thinking of any of them right now.
I think we have time for one last question.
Hi, I have a question for Steve. You kind of mentioned that in her first review of Trilby, Cather kind of gave this kind of unqualified praise of Trilby as a character, and that's what she really loved about the novel. I guess my question is, did she love anything else about the novel? And also, I feel like, I mean, Alexandra Bergson is like definitely just a character that she wanted people to love, and she wanted people to love as much as she loved her. So like that very clearly comes across, just like, I want my readers to love this heroine. I don't know, just like anything else she was inspired by in popular literature that she wanted people to love about her books, I'd be interested in hearing about.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I have thought, why did Cather like this book? And what she says herself, that it's feeling, it's your heart. It's not the plot.
Yeah.
The plot is pretty exploitive and melodramatic. It's not the writing. Her opening description of Trilby, of Svengali. His thick, heavy, languid, lusterless, black hair. The novel démeublé, this is not. And that's repeated over and over, and I would have thought she would have gotten irritated with that. So as near as I can tell, it simply hit her it touched her with that sense of feeling. And I admit it doesn't hit me as much, but it must have a lot of people. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies in the first year. 300,000 in the United States, I think, alone.
This is just a quick add-on and maybe a question, Steve. But as I remember when I read Trilby, when she comes in to the room full of, to the atelier full of artists, and they're of course all men, and she has her chin up and her head back, and she's saucy, and she answers back, and I can see Cather liking a woman like that and thinking, this is a kind of gal who took no guff off the men, and got them to buy her dinner, but could take them or leave them, and that picture that you put up that was Domerguez's picture expresses that defiance and sauciness, and there was that about her character that I think was very appealing, and probably appealing to women who were taught to be demure and quiet in their place and with their clothes on.
Yeah. And she brought up the fact that she poses. She says, "Oh, I have to go. I have a posing to do. I'll be in the All Together, And one of the men says, "In the All Together?" And she then proceeds to itemize some of the items. And likewise, they compliment her feet, which is a recurring theme in the novel. And she shows her foot, and she's wearing men's shoes, so not to really showing them off, but so she takes the shoe off and shows, and she said, "This is the most wonderful foot in Paris. She said, there's only one that matches it," and she takes off the other shoe. So yeah, that kind of spirit she had.
Well, and it's a pity we all can't go by Trilby Oxfords and Beatrice, but thank all of you very much. Thanks to our panelists, and thanks for great questions.